Henry James has earned the title of master because of his oeuvre, his body of work, and the contributions he's made to literary theory and literary criticism. His output was prodigious. One would be hard-pressed to find a more consummate man or woman of letters. James wrote novels, biography and autobiography, journalism, plays, travel writing, reportage, literary criticism, and 112 stories. He published his first story when he was 21. He was prolific and deeply and passionately committed to the literary life and made a living with the writer's life. He also wrote with considerably more detail and, well, length. He was said to have found the 8,000-word limit typical of his era of short story magazine length to be confining, and he called his short fiction nouvelles. The story we will be discussing, The Real Thing, is over 10. The United States would initially not join Britain and France in the First World War. James's brother William was a famous psychologist and the father of American pragmatism. There's an old saw that William James was a psychologist who wrote like a novelist, and Henry James, the novelist who wrote like a psychologist. Many of James's tales are deeply psychological. The Turn of the Screw, for example, published in 1898. And they tread into nuances of human behavior. James also brings to the crest of 19th century realism. His interest in painting, especially Impressionism, was strong and can be seen in the story The Real Thing. Much of his work concerned the nuances and their themes, and every I dotted, every T crossed, every fiber of the carpet in a story contributing to its overall loom as opposed to a wider canvas. This extended into a debate about the novel called the saturation-selection debate, featured James's notion of compactness and selectivity on the one hand, and H.G. Wells' idea that fiction can have a broader and more expansive, less compact canvas. The debate emerged years later when F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby. For James, it constituted nothing less than a debate about aesthetics. This story has its genesis and origins in ideas that he would turn into stories. He wrote that he wanted this particular story to include a magnificent lesson. The lesson in The Real Thing is disconnected from the moral universe of theology and right or wrong behavior or good and evil. It has to do in many ways more with art as well as with humanity, but particularly with the imagination. And like Maupassant's The Necklace, the differences between appearance and reality. Essentially, it's the story of an unnamed artist who creates illustrations for pot-boiling type cheap books. The monarchs are a well-bred aristocratic couple who come to the artist's studio, and he assumes they want to be painted by him. But it turns out they're indigent. They want work as models. This initial confusion about the appearance of reality versus reality sets up for us the major motif in this story, or certainly one of the major motifs. The monarchs cannot even pose for what presumably they are, an upper-class couple, because the artist draws them as larger than they actually are, and he can't transpose them to fit other roles. We see this in contrast to his other pair of models, a working-class British woman named Miss Churm, and an Italian street ice vendor named Orante. Miss Churm, the artist narrator tells us, and he has no name in this story, and as we move into the 20th century, we'll see many more narrators who have no name. Miss Churm was, quote, only a freckled cockney, but she could represent everything from a fine lady to a shepherdess, end of quote. He tells us of Orante, his other model, quote, he was sallow but fair, and when I put him into some old clothes of my own, he looked like an Englishman. He was as good as Miss Churm, who could look when requested like an Italian, end of quote. So both models are able somehow to act as catalysts for what the narrator calls the alchemy of art. They can pose in ways that allow for representing them as what they are not, while the poor monarchs, as far as the narrator is concerned and his art is concerned, can't be anything but what they are, the real thing, particularly for the illustrations that he's doing. The narrator says, when I drew the monarchs, I couldn't anyhow get away from them, get into the character I wanted to represent, and I hadn't the least desire my model should be discoverable in my picture. The story is short, but in James's word, magnificent in its lesson on the nature of the creation of art. The monarchs are the real thing, but art, including, of course, literary art, creating short fiction, by its nature is representational. It must have that alchemy or plasticity as well as the imagination working together with what's real. The classic literary theme of this division and interaction between appearance and reality infuses its meaning into this story as we discover that the artist requires the vehicle of his imagination to transform reality into appearance, to hold the mirror up to nature in order to make something real from raw material which is not real. What the poet Marianne Moore in 1923 would call imaginary gardens with real toads in them. So the imagination can transfigure a Cockney Eliza Doolittle type like Miss Churm into a Russian princess, or a poor Italian peasant and street peddler like Orante into a gentleman. The monarchs can only look like what they appear to be, though once the narrator imagines the major as a footman, the monarchs begin to move from appearance to the reality of, well, their poverty, to being tea servers, appearing noble and heroic and admirable to the narrator in the process. As Mrs. Monarch fixes Miss Churm's hair and picks up a dirty rag, and the major picks up breakfast things, models become servants, and servants become models. Subjects like the monarchs, and the name is transparently significant of how they appear, they look majestic, perhaps even regal. But they can't be rendered with any imaginative life beyond a kind of photographic replication, at least not by the narrator in trying to use them as models for his illustrations. Realism, James is suggesting, needs the vitality of the imagination. James appears to be saying it needs that vitality lest it be simply a replication, a photograph that duplicates reality rather than a work of art that infuses it with a life of its own. Moreover, the monarchs are the real thing in their appearance, but underneath the surface appearance of gentlefolk of higher social status is a couple out of work, at the end of their economic options, barely surviving hand to mouth, and desperate for, though highly unsuitable for most work. There are a couple who are deeply devoted to one another, in reality within the artist's studio. James had the advantage of seeing the British class system as it was being challenged from within from his unique perspective as an American outsider. Jack Hawley, a character in the story who is the narrator-artist's friend, becomes the fresh eye who sees and corroborates the chasm of the social divide and its connection to the failure of the art to be ignited with real life. When Mrs. Monarch cries, as she does in the story, it's because she recognizes the gap between their appearance as a fluid thing, like the appearance of reality projected by Orante and Miss Churm. But through the course of the story, as we get deeper into understanding the monarchs and their humanity, they become the real thing in another sense. It's like a lot of Chinese boxes, or a kind of, well, labyrinthine world that James presents us between appearance on the one hand and reality on the other, between what can lift something into art as opposed to, let's say, just pot-boiling illustrations, types as opposed to distinct individuals, amateurs as apart from professionals. There's all this binary in the story, this division or dichotomy of so many things that make for its richness. The monarchs are really noble and dignified people. And that's what they appear to be. They're real people as well as types representational of a certain social class of gentlefolk, a gentleman and his lady, if you will. And it turns out, as I said, that their marriage is a real marriage. They're types, but they're also individuals, humans. Jack Hawley's enmity against the class system and his seeing the monarchs as types lead him, and he's a good critic but not so good a painter, to feel that they don't belong in the artist's studio. But the reality is that they do, because they create for the artist another reality grounded in memory. Values ultimately emerge from the story's lesson about appearance and reality and elevate the story to an even greater plane. Let me get to the beginning of the story, because there is certainly a distinctiveness about James's style that one recognizes in the way he uses detail, in the way he presents a picture to us. And remember that this is the opening of a story where was the most practical thing they could have done. In this way, their embarrassment served their cause. He's speaking about this with the knowledge that they were there to have not to have their portraits painted, but they were there to get jobs as models. I had seen people painfully reluctant to mention that they desired anything so gross as to be represented on canvas, but the scruples of my new friends appeared almost insurmountable. Yet the gentleman might have said, "I should like a portrait for my wife," and the lady might have said, "I should like a portrait of my husband." Perhaps they weren't husband and wife. This naturally would make the matter more delicate. Perhaps they wished to be done together, in which case they ought to have brought a third person to break the news. And you see his mind is traveling all over here, thinking, what are they here for? He's trying to get the real picture, the real thing of what they're doing there. We come from Mr. Rivet, right as a rivet. The lady finally said with a dim smile that had the effect of a moist sponge passed over a sunk piece of painting, as well as of a vague allusion to vanished beauty. And notice what James is able to do in one sentence there. See things from a painter's point of view, like a sponge on a canvas, in terms of the way he's seeing the woman, but also giving us that sense that she was probably beautiful one time, but has aged. She was as tall and straight in her degree as her companion, and with 10 years less to carry. She looked as sad as a woman could look, whose face was not charged with expression. That is, her tinted oval mask showed waste as an exposed surface shows friction. The hand of time had played over her freely, but to an effect of elimination. She was slim and stiff and so well dressed in dark blue cloth with lappets and pockets and buttons that it was clear she employed the same tailor as her husband. The couple had an identifiable air of prosperous thrift. They evidently got a good deal of luxury for their money. If I was to be one of their luxuries, it would behoove me to consider my terms. Here again, he's hoping that he's going to be able to draw them. But you notice how he's sizing them up. He's looking at their clothes, he's looking at their countenance, he's looking at essentially what they are presenting simply in terms of, he doesn't want to necessarily be doing potboiler illustrations. He wants to be, well, a more serious artist. He wants to be an artist more worthy of being an artist or having the nomenclature artist. There's personal growth and transformation in the story as well, especially in what the narrator learns from the monarchs, whom, as I said, he represents initially as colossal in his paintings, only to discover their essential humanity. That makes him, as he says at the end, whether we believe him or not is another story, but he says he's content to have paid the price for the remembrance. They wind up doing servile domestic tasks, holding to the studio for the warmth of the fire like charity cases, but maintaining their dignity. And even as the narrator feels dreadful to see them emptying my slops, he recognizes that something has occurred here, some kind of transformation has occurred. It's the kind of transformation that frankly can occur as a result of the artistic imagination. Characters are changed from types to something quite different, from the appearance of what they might be or what they might even be to something that embodies that but that becomes magically different. And this story rises above many of its intricate and well-woven themes to give us a rather moving sense of all that can emerge and all that is real that can occur as a result of human contact and the value of real memories that are created. Yet there's possibly another paradoxical reality underneath that appearance, or underneath the appearance that we get at the end of the story in the narrator's point of view of personal memories to cherish when the monarchs are remembered in sadness. And Jack Hawley is cited in the story's final sentence as telling the narrator that the monarchs did him a permanent harm, got him into false ways. Let's go to the end of the story and see what James is getting at here, which isn't all that simple, to be sure. The Major, meanwhile, had also been looking for something to do, and wandering to the other end of the studio, saw before him my breakfast things, neglected, unremoved. "I say, can I be useful here?" he called out to me with an irrepressible quaver. I assented with a laugh that I fear was awkward, and for the next 10 minutes while I worked, I heard the light clatter of china and the tinkle of spoons and glass. Now, before this takes place, and you really get that sense of nuance from James, the subtlety with which he can present character and bring a rounded sense, a full sense of character out for us. Before that, we heard Mrs. Monarch in her sweet voice, he says beside or rather above me, saying, "I wish her hair were a little better done." He's talking about Miss Churm, the model. I looked up, and she was staring with a strange fixedness at Miss Churm, whose back was turned to her. "Do you mind my just touching it?" she went on, a question which made me spring up for an instant, as with the instinctive fear that she might do the young lady a harm, but she quieted me with a glance. "I shall never forget. I confess I should like to have been able to paint that." And there you see that kind of subtlety of James's hand, along with the eye of the artist. And just in one glance, James gives us that whole movement from being afraid that this lady is going to do some harm to Miss Churm to realizing that everything is just fine. Now back to Mr. Monarch, or to Major Monarch, and the last moments in the story. Mrs. Monarch assisted her husband. They washed up my crockery. They put it away. Again, they're acting in a way that they need to just be useful. but it also reflects their real need for some kind of occupation, for some kind of job, or way to bring in at least some income. And this is very difficult because these are dignified people. These are people who we see throughout the story have a sense of not only class about them, but real class. They appear to be of the higher class because they are of the higher class, but they're also classy people. And he says that they wandered off a law in virtue of which the real thing could be so much less precious than the unreal. But they didn't want to starve. If my servants were my models, then my models might be my servants. They would reverse the parts. The others would sit for the ladies and gentlemen, and they would do the work. They would still be in the studio. It was an intense, dumb appeal to me not to turn them out. Take us on, they wanted to say. We'll do anything. This is his perception, and certainly we believe that perception from everything we've seen of the monarchs and from the way that they're behaving. My pencil dropped from my hand, just in that gesture alone. We see the effect and the impact that this has had on him. My sitting was spoiled, and I got rid of my sitters, who were also evidently rather mystified and awestruck. Then, alone with the major and his wife, I had a most uncomfortable moment. He put their prayer into a single sentence. I say, you know, just let us do for you, can't you? I couldn't. It was dreadful to see them emptying my slops, but I pretended I could to oblige them for about a week. Then I gave them a sum of money to go away, and I never saw them again. I obtained the remaining books, but my friend Hawley repeats that Major and Mrs. Monarch did me a permanent harm, got me into false ways. If it be true, I'm content to have paid the price for the memory. Well, we're left with that ambiguity. Did Hawley see things right? Or does the narrator see things right? We don't really know when we come to the end of the story. And we don't know because to a great extent we have seen the constant fluctuation between what's real and what appears to be real, between the real thing, as the title suggests, and what may indeed be the real thing. A lot of this has to do with the narrators creating these potboiler illustrations. These don't seem to be the real thing, and yet they have a reality about them. They're done for commercial or mercantile reasons, if you will, but they're also done with the necessity of the artistic imagination. It's as if James wants to say to us, well, you can talk all you want to in a demeaning way about commercial art, or art that's done for commercial reasons, but it still requires that quickening of the artistic imagination to make the representation real. And remember that this was a writer who built his life economically around writing. We get that sense, in other words, that the commercial may be the real thing, or may certainly have the elements of the real thing where art is concerned. But does that mean that by contrast, art, the highest kind of art that artists aspire to, that this artist aspires to, may have less than the real thing, or may not be real? It's one of those sort of quandaries that Henry James is so gifted at presenting to readers and making readers grapple with. It's one of the things that makes his art so special in the minds of those who particularly appreciate what he can do as a writer. And he brings us into this sometimes confusing world of appearance and reality in ways that probably are inimitable, that we see in perhaps a few other writers, but we don't see with this kind of exacting detail. We don't see with the kind of concentration that we see in a story like this. And remember that, as I said before, his stories are longer. And his stories have much more detail. We saw that in the early passage I read, with just all of the detail that's given to us that's important nonetheless. Sounds like a tailor or a barber at one point, he says. No, I'm not a tailor or a barber, but, you know, I size people up for portraits. I have to look at what they're wearing. I have to get a sense of their type. I have to see how their grooms support the real art that he feels, in this case, he wants to be creating and that he's particularly drawn to. We know so many artists who write in order to, well, make what they think is their greater expectation as far as their own artistic impulses are concerned. And we see in a story like The Real Thing the kind of aesthetic battle that goes on, and maybe battle is too strong a word, but it is a kind of battle. Nietzsche could talk about the battle of the sexes. I can talk about the battle between aesthetic aspirations on the one hand for a higher and loftier art, and the world of commercial art, and the world of illustrations. Because what you begin to see is they both require a kind of I'll use the word propinquity advisedly. They both require a kind of closeness or intimacy to what is real and what is illusory, what is actual or authentic and what is made up or imagined. They both, in other words, require the essentials of art. You can't write commercial art or potboiler art, even if you don't want to call it art, without that same kind of impulse. I once spent a good deal of time wanting to be a novelist, and I realized it couldn't be the kind of artist that I wanted to be, just missing a dearth, or having a dearth of talent and missing the kind of talent necessary, only missing that slight ingredient. But I also thought that perhaps I could write a potboiler. And I remember reading all these potboilers by potboiler novelists like Harold Robbins and Jacqueline Suzanne. Thing for now, and we move on to the 20th century and another cluster of stories. It's almost appropriate in many ways to leave James, as we do, right at the crest of the 20th century, because we leave a certain kind of storytelling. We move into what is often described as modernism. And we begin with another initiation story by the famous great Irish writer James Joyce, whom many consider the 20th century's greatest novelist. Like Henry James, Joyce was a prodigious talent, as well as an expatriate, who left his native Ireland but discovered that Ireland never left his imagination, even when he lived away from it. Joyce not only marks the turn of a new century for us, but he also marks a decided turn toward symbolism and what would come to be called modernism. And he was a writer like Henry James who was completely and totally dedicated to his art, who was a consummate writer and artist and literary artist. He was a writer of realistic stories, but he also conferred a poetic sensibility onto his short fiction, as well as his novels. He gave us the great novel Ulysses, as well as other major works of fiction.